everybody. I'm Pastor Megan Rohr from Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, and I have with me
Pastor Amanda ZENTZ-ALO. I serve at Central Lutheran Church in Northeast Portland, Oregon.
And today we are having our weekly Blessing for Those Who Mourn service, and I'm going to let Pastor Amanda tell you what that service is about.
So each week we gather here online and share it across our platforms in order to make space and time to recognize the mourning that we are experiencing. We have been gathering since Good Friday, the week after Good Friday last year, and to take space as a Good Friday time to recognize that there is sadness and things worth admitting are worth mourning right now. A lot of the time in our life, we pass through and ignore our sadness and ignore our mourning or just kind of stuff it. But we, every single week through this pandemic, have taken the time to recognize that what we are experiencing is hard. It is sad. There is grief, and there are things to hold in deep prayer. We also take the time to review the numbers for the week. And so, Pastor Megan, do you have those numbers?
I do. And today we are recording on March 12th. And as of today, there have been 2.63 million deaths to the coronavirus worldwide, 530,000 deaths of the coronavirus in the United States, which includes 1,522 individuals who died yesterday. And we share these numbers, even though they're overwhelming and large, because we believe that we need to kind of like continue to hear this so that we continue to be as safe as we can, and in hopes that as we are imagining what life is going to be like over the next couple of weeks, that as we do that from different perspectives. I've had 2 vaccination doses. Pastor Amanda is someone who has not had any and likely is on the bottom branch of the triage and will be gladfully awaiting their number to be called for that. But we are wading through some of the joys that part of the world is reopening, some of the sadness that we have survived and others have not, the deep mourning that comes from the fact that many of those who have died from the coronavirus are disproportionately people of color, and that the vaccine distribution also is having a difficult time making it to spaces where people of color live. And so that is part of our gathering. We hold all of these things as the United States kind of begins to celebrate a 1-year anniversary. It's been a little bit longer here in San Francisco, so we declared our emergency slightly sooner. We thought that today we would review some of the timeline stuff that just comes along with emergencies, just as a check-in, not because you are necessarily sad or having a hard time with the trauma, but because it's a thing that happens to everyone. And so here I'm just going to put up these common symptoms of compassion fatigue. This is something that you can get from caring for other people. So not necessarily because you were a part of a traumatic incident, but I think after a year of living with the coronavirus, it would be pretty common to have more than one of these 8 things. And so you can just do kind of a self check-in to see where you might be. You might even think about over the past year if any of these have applied to you and how they might have changed. This is the typical kind of trauma timeline, and you'll notice over here on the 1-year anniversary mark, there are some things that happen, like just that date happened, and some of the smells around you, some of the allergens that tickle the back of your throat, some of the outfits that you might have worn in this season last year when all of this grief kind of started coming to us. Maybe some of the same school year rhythms or holiday rhythms or vacation travel rhythms. Those things can trigger you and make you wonder a little bit about what's happening. The difficulty with this coronavirus disaster is that we have not only had, this timeline here that would be like if just the first day that it became an emergency in the United States, this is the timeline that we would be on. But if there were significant events during the coronavirus, like the times you didn't know if you would die when you went to the grocery store, each of those would be another event with its own timeline. And so many of us will have intersecting timelines, but we also will have, we're also still all right here. This is the impact. It's when the emergency has happened. So we're not out of this emergency yet, which means the day that we are able to have a big party, if that's a specific day that the coronavirus is over, that's when this 1 year timeline will start, that will begin to continue to acknowledge all the heroes who have pulled together. We might feel a big sense of community cohesion. Maybe there's some sort of block party you can attend, or maybe it's 4th of July if President Biden's dreaming is close. Maybe it's a Thanksgiving party. Maybe it's a Christmas party. We don't know. But after that, celebrating that things are closed, remember that we also have a backlog of people who might be interested in having fuller funerals. And so it might be that in the midst of this celebrating that the coronavirus is over, that now there are more funerals in a row than most communities have experienced. You might have as many invitations to funerals as you might normally have at a summer for weddings. And that will
very real,
be different for people. And I want to name that there also might be ways that the world has to have grief together. We haven't figured out yet what artists are going to do to inspire us to get through this time. We haven't figured out yet what's going to be the meaningful keepsakes from this time, or the visual symbols or the sayings or the phrases that kind of help us through this time. And so know that we are a year into this, but in terms of how trauma works in our body, we haven't even started the part where the trauma hits us yet, right? If this is us during this emergency of coronavirus, imagine your ups and downs, your peaks and your valleys, your lowest lows. Know that when no one is looking later after this emergency has resolved itself, however that looks, there's still another low below that. That's going to happen in that time, the year after kind of recovery. And so we are talking about wellness and care for you over the long haul, right? So this space right here of community coming together might be funerals, where you get to see people and grieve in community and hug again. And then, as often happens after a funeral, when no one's looking, people have the real private grief that they maybe didn't want to have with other people around. So pay attention to yourself, pay attention to others, check in on people. Below this, though, so this is just the timeline of what the peaks and valleys look like. I also want to show you what the emotions look like. So we're still kind of in this space of the immediate emergency. After our emergency is over, there is also kind of a 2-week to 6-month time. You might have experienced some of these already: loss of appetite, forgetfulness, exhaustion, nightmares, things that can happen after we're out of kind of this space. You might have experienced some of these on an individual timeline. If you lost someone dear to you or many people dear to you, this might be your grief timeline as well. And then a year after, or every year, if you are someone who every year it's 9/11, take in a deep breath of remembering and maybe have some of these things. That's similar to what we're going to encounter for anniversaries, for however it is that we're kind of communally grieving this time period. And then all along, at any time, just because we've been through this difficulty together, we can experience a wave of any of these things, of memories coming when we don't want them to, of, feeling like your world is less orderly. If you have restructured and rescheduled your life, if you have a really good COVID routine, when you leave your house again, you might not feel like you have a routine anymore, and you might feel like you lost your structure and you have to figure out a brand new calendar for how to go back to work, and how much are you going to go back to work, and what is that going to look like for you. And so that's a very common thing. I also wanted to add one last resource before we just kind of go into our full conversation. For those who are experiencing this and want someone to kind of talk them through maybe some guided trauma care, obviously therapy is something that you can seek out. Social workers is something you can think out. Chaplains is something you can think out. Pastors or something, deacons, whatever your normal go-to of like trauma care or grief care are all people that you can seek out. But if you're someone who is looking for an alternative way, because everyone's a part of this emergency, sometimes you don't want to like ask for help from another person who's also having a difficult time from this emergency, that one of the things that is available is an audiobook by Peter Levine. Peter Levine developed somatic experiencing, which is a type of trauma care that focuses on the body. You don't have to tell the story to try to get the trauma out of your body, but you just pay attention to what your body is up to and ways that you can heal it. It not only will educate you about what trauma is and how you can care for it, but there are some guided meditations that you can do. It's not something that is recommended for people to listen to while they're driving, but is something that you could do in your own house. And if you can't afford therapy and you just want a one-time thing that you can purchase. So I'll pause talking for a second and invite Amanda into the conversation. This is going to be a weird thing that we're all kind of learning together. It's not very common that we experience emergencies over this long time period, and they weren't as they didn't have the same vocabulary for trauma when they were managing kind of polio, and when they were managing the Spanish flu and some of the other health things that have swept through and taken a really long amount of time to care for in the United States and around the world. So do you have any thoughts about the time frames of caring for yourself that we can remind people about?
I think it's one of those that we also need to understand that this is a kind of a general attempt to find a way to understand this sort of a thing versus a prescriptive, right? Like some folks will experience things differently than others. Some folks, their high will last longer. Some folks, their low will last longer. Some folks will get really caught up, not by the anniversary date, but by something else that happens, right? And sometimes when it comes to kind of that somatic reaction and understanding that you might get to an anniversary date and be like, oh, I'm totally fine. Everything's fine. But then like you haven't eaten in a week, or you're just eating carbs all the time, all the mashed potatoes all the time. And that's not like you. And that our body remembers those things, even if we don't remember those things. And so recognizing maybe you have what I do on my Google Calendar is I will put dates even for people that are particularly my loved ones, right? Like if I know that there's a particular grief date anniversary, I'll put it onto my Google Calendar and have it repeat every year so I can check in with that individual on that date. And I don't always do a great job of it, but at least on that day, I can see it and I can hold that person in intentional prayer. And then hopefully maybe check in with them, because we don't always catch them ourselves. And I think it's very true right now that we find ourselves continuing in this. We could see this pattern, the kind of the heroic time and everybody gathering together as community. Like if we think of last spring around Easter, people were really like holding on. And then the summer, we kind of dipped because we were kind of giving up. And by fall, we were so done with all of this, right? Like, we can see that pattern within the last year, but it's super important what Pastor Megan said about the fact that we are still in the midst of this. And it's super critical to understand that we keep paying attention, that we're not through yet. And so participating in the ways that we are able to, and all of the precautions and getting our vaccines once they're available to us and those kinds of things, those are really important opportunities and important things that we need to be doing, recognizing we're still in the midst. Yeah. Megan.
I also think there's a number of lessons we've learned as people who have lived through the AIDS epidemic. Particularly here in San Francisco and with the LGBTQ community, is that there may be times where there's an outbreak again. There may be a time when strands change, right? There may be a time when medications change. There may be a time when it just hits us and we don't know why it's hitting us that particular time. Or things that are perceived as other injustices that remind us of the way that we felt. And so it could be that it's not even just like smells or tangible things that are stirring things up for you. It could be something that just makes you feel a similar way, right? Something that makes you feel the same as when you felt like you couldn't leave your house and you were trapped could bring you, and you could wonder, like, there's just like an inflatable pool in the yard and I can't leave my house. I'm making up a silly example to not trigger people, right? So like, it could be something that is not an emergency or not what someone thinks is a real emergency. And because it taps into that place inside of you that felt that way, particularly if you had stuff when you were a little kid that also felt that way, that I think trauma is like boogers. It tries to stick together with other stuff. And you gotta kind of like just keep checking out what's going on in your body, care for yourself the best that you can. And if you start to kind of, have an accelerated heart rate and feel like your chest is having a hard time breathing, and you're maybe feeling nauseous in your tummy, maybe you're feeling a little floaty in your brain, like before you pass out, and you're starting to feel a little distant. For me, it comes with this fear in the back of my head that I don't actually know how to breathe. And what if I'm not breathing enough? And that little voice wants me to breathe really fast. And so I usually count with my breathing. And once I rhythmically slow my breathing, that voice goes away and the heart rate goes back down. So those things can just start happening in your body and you might never, ever, ever know why. But just pay attention to them, that trust your body, that if it starts to feel like it started to feel back when it was hard, that you can care for yourself as if you are still living in that emergency, because your body might be stuck in time, right? And there might be parts of your body that go back in time to what it, to if you were in an emergency and truly scared about what was happening, you might not have been able to fully feel it at the time. And now your body feels safe enough to fully feel it.
Absolutely.
The thing that I would also just lift up for folk kind of before we kind of pray it out, if that's a way to say it, is that we bring this up not because we want you to feel like you have more things you need to learn how to do, but just so that if it happens in the future, you kind of know what it is before it scares you, right? And you know that there were people who said, yeah, that's a pretty normal way to feel later. Or if you're trying to pinpoint, if it saves you, here's the way I'll say it. If it saves your relationship with a family member to know that the reason you're angry is due to a trauma or a stress or an emergency and not because you actually care about wiffle balls or whatever the thing that you're having a large scale argument about, or to know that your partner is being very angry about something that you think doesn't matter and you're not sure why, and you're taking it personally, even though it's
Super real.
emergency based, that you can kind of have ways of understanding where people are in their grief.
Yeah.
Because sometimes if we see it as someone grieving, we know how to care for them. But if we see it as someone being irrationally angry at me and I don't deserve it, then we're in maybe a defensive place instead of a support space. And so, yeah, so just be aware that these things happen. Know that if you're on social media, those reminders starting now of what were you doing a year ago might not be happy reminders, and they might be something that kind of reminds you of a time that you forgot how hard it was. So,
absolutely. I've seen a couple of those come up already in the last week for me, and it was a hard week because of those 1 year ago todays. Yeah. And my apologies for Annabelle. She's trying to chew holes in my clothing, and I'm trying to stop her so I'm trying to give her hair to distract her instead of my clothes. So
now,
I apologize. I know.
Trauma is a hard thing to navigate. And sometimes we overeat to do it. Sometimes we make unhealthy choices.
She's just trying to preen. She wants something to chew on, and I would rather her do the hair than my clothes.
Yeah. So, Annabelle, anything that you do to get through today is very normal. But maybe next time you could make a healthier choice. And then the time after that, maybe a little healthier choice. And maybe just for the purpose of Pastor Amanda, whatever the least expensive choice is would be really lovely, Miss Annabelle. Yeah, because our pets have carried our stress for this year too.
Oh, huge amount. Huge amount. Yeah.
And might have had to have change of diets if grocery stores were difficult to get to, and might have had so many things that they also navigated, even if they didn't understand what insurrection meant, or pandemic, or even if they're not in the vaccination line. So
a huge routine change for them, and a huge routine change coming, potentially.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Annabelle, you can get attention for having good feelings just as much as having bad feelings. It'll be okay. Well, shall we pray before we kind of fall off the deep end here?
Let's do it. Let's do it. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for the ways in which you remain with us through all of our life experiences. We give you thanks for companions along the journey, for wisdom shared within community. And we ask on this day that you would help us to remember that we are not alone even when we feel isolated. For the griefs that we carry, the loss of those we love to COVID, the loss of opportunities, the changes in our structure, the loss of those that we have released in the last year who have died from suicide, those who have been lost to cancer, relationships that have been strained beyond redeeming, the shifts and changes of our everyday. We ask that you would hear our prayers and send your comfort on the wings of the Spirit into our lives. Give us courage. Help us to see hope. Guide us as we continue this long journey through this experience throughout our world together. Hold us in your love and guide us in your grace. These things we pray together. Amen.
Amen. And as we do each week, we remember those words that Jesus prayed with those he held dear and the vulnerable around him. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed, I touched the page, sorry. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure at heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Dear ones, we love you. We are in this with you. And know that God is with you and cannot ever be taken for you. Live forgiven, claim your wholeness, and go in peace.